Insight is the experience of a sudden and profound understanding. It happens without warning or invitation and causes a radical transformation in you. For instance, you may have an insight into belief that radically changes what you believe in. Insight works by illuminating a part of your conditioning, enabling it to be seen for the first time. That perception produces an understanding of how your mind works. You are then able to operate from that understanding to think and act rationally. The outcome of insight depends on the condition it illuminates. When you have an insight into a condition that is harmful, the condition will be immediately dropped by the mind. For instance, when you have an insight into the futility of control, the mind will cease to control itself psychologically. When you have an insight into a condition that is necessary, the mind will continue operating that way, but in complete awareness of the way it is operating. For instance, when you have an insight that thought originates from knowledge, you continue to think, but in complete awareness that the thoughts you are having are coming from knowledge. The change that takes place in our conditioning happens without any resistance. The mind simply acts in accordance with the insight. So, what does insight show us? Insight provides us with an understanding of how we are conditioned, and that enables us to deduce a time before that insight happened, a time when we were functioning without that understanding. Insight shows us that we function in ignorance of how we are conditioned. For instance, a believer may believe something but not understand how belief works. In this way, you could think of a person like a computer program that does not understand how it is programmed, and insight as an activity that shows the program how it is programmed. To describe this, Krishnamurti used the analogy of thought functioning in darkness and insight being the light that dispelled darkness. Insight shows us that the comprehension of our conditioning has the capacity to change our conditioning. For instance, a believer may believe something simply because they do not understand how belief works. They may then have an insight into belief that causes the beliefs they have to be immediately dropped. Insight appears and disappears in an instant, while the comprehension of insight endures over time. This is why Kay and Bohm referred to insight as a flash and the outcome of insight as light. Those of you that have had insight will notice something significant about it. The insight is never proved wrong. You may have the insight 10 years ago, but it still remains true to this day. This is different to many of the understandings we have that are disproven or refined over time. This, however, does not appear to apply to insight. Insight appears to remain true forever. So, how is this possible? To understand how this is possible, we first have to understand where insight comes from. To examine this, we can take each feature of the mind and ask ourselves whether insight arises from there. Does insight arise from a thought? Do you think something and then insight arises? The answer is no. Does insight arise from a feeling? Do you feel something and then insight arises? The answer is no. Does insight arise from a choice? Do you choose to have insight? The answer is no. Does insight arise from effort? Is insight the result of a sheer act of will? The answer is no. Does insight arise from a perception? Do you see something and then insight arises? The answer is no. Insight does not come after a perception. Insight is a perception itself. For instance, you may have observed a psychological problem hundreds of times and never had an insight about it. Then one day you were walking through the forest and suddenly, out of nowhere, you have this insight about it. Does insight arise from a way of perceiving something? Is there a right way to perceive something that causes insight to happen? The answer is no. There is no way of looking at something that produces an insight. When you have an insight, you do not have it because you were looking at something in a certain way. The answer to all these questions shows you that insight does not arise from anything you do or from anything you perceive. And this is why insight is true. Anything you do is the response of knowledge. Anything you see is interpreted by knowledge. Insight, not being the result of anything you do or see, means that insight bypasses knowledge entirely. Thus, we can refer to insight as a pure perception. A pure perception is truth, and the outcome of truth is order. So, where does insight arise from? What you will notice is that insight arises only when the mind is silent, and that means the requirement for insight is a silent mind. Insight emerges from that silence and demonstrates its immense capacity to transform the conditioning of the brain. And to understand how that is possible, you must understand the nature of silence.